Our next speaker, speaking of my classroom, has been an incredibly valuable participant in my classes in the Baltimore food system. And he's also one of the top innovators and thinkers and doers in the Baltimore food system. So we're really excited to have him here. He's the Reverend Dr. Heber Brown III. He's the founding executive director of the Black Church Food Security Network, an asset-based approach to advancing food and land sovereignty by organizing the vast resources of historic African American congregations in both rural and urban communities.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to share with you a little bit of the work of the Black Church Food Security Network and what is it that we've been doing for officially since 2015, but my church has been growing food since 2008. In fact, let me start there. I pastored the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church in Baltimore, and I've been the pastor there for 11 years. I come from a family of preachers and ministers, and so I'm pretty much steeped in especially Black Baptist congregational leadership, and I'm grateful to be leading one of the best churches in all of Baltimore, Pleasant Hope. They might be watching. I got to make sure I say that. Next slide. And so I want to talk a little bit about pushing beyond charity and pushing a little bit beyond food access as well. And doing that, next slide, I want to start with language and come to terms a little bit. I'm coming from an angle of a practitioner and more of a community activist and grassroots organizer. And so for our work, we are more so interested in hinging our focus on food sovereignty. So food sovereignty, this is from La Via Campesina, an international farmers and landowners and peasants organization. Food sovereignty, in fact, let's do this real quick. I know I got time on me, but usually when I do this particular slide in workshops, I ask people to call out a word that resonates with you as I read through the definition, right? And so if the speaks to your heart in some kind of way, you just say the as loud as you can. I want you to notice with me what happens to the room as I read the definition, where the room gets loud and where the room gets quiet. Let's just see what happens. Food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. That was pretty cool. So during Q&A, let's talk about what you noticed and how it got loud or when it got quiet. Next. And I agree with Nevin. I don't know where he went, but in terms of, there you are. I hate the term too, food deserts. Really grateful for the work of Karen Washington, one of the co-founders of Black Urban Growers called Bugs, who offers this. What I would rather say instead of food desert is food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole food system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root cause of some of the problems around the food system. I was with my good friend, Dr. Monica White, recently, author of a dynamic book called Freedom Farmers. And in her workshop, she expressly said, if anybody leaves my workshop and says food desert ever again, I'll disown you. And so I want to encourage us to even lean into a different kind of language because it matters when you're trying to understand these issues around food. Next. So here's my church. Bottom right corner, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. Its roots in the late 1800s. And these two cool churches hooked up. Mount Pleasant and Good Hope Mission Church decided to form one church in 1933. Took a piece of the name of each one and called it Pleasant Hope. And I think it's pretty cool because in my tradition, a lot of churches are born because people get mad at each other, stomp out, leave, and start their own church. I think it's really cool that this church started because people came together and figured out that they could do better together. So that's the bottom right. The top left is a fresh food market in the Baltimore area, really nice food market. At the time of this photograph, though, and really some of the story around it is when I started pastoring 11 years ago, I was disturbed by how much I was in the hospital visiting members of my church and realizing that many of them were hospitalized because of diet-related illnesses. Seminary taught me to read scripture, pray, encourage, and all that's cool. After a while, though, I got a little bit tired of just reading scripture and praying, especially when I heard over and over and over again diet-related issues were a part of the equation of why they were hospitalized. I came back to my church one day after a hospital visit and I said, we got to do something about this. The idea that came to mind was to develop a partnership with this fresh food market, which is across the street, across the main road there called York Road, which is a historic red line, in fact, in Baltimore City. In fact, it's not too far, Nevin, from where you just put, that's my neighborhood you put on the screen. I said, let's cross the street, develop a partnership with this fresh food market, pipeline this nutrient-rich food from this market to my church. And that's one thing we can do to improve health outcomes for our congregation. I went over there, put on my best little preacher suit, walked into the fresh food market with the idea to connect with the manager of the market and talk to them about some kind of partnership or collaboration. Before I got to that office, though, I walked through the aisles of the store and I saw the prices of this fresh food in this store. And I said, oh, my goodness, this is not going to work. We are not going to be able to develop a partnership because this food is completely out of the reach economically of me and the people I'm privileged to share life with at the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. And some might say, well, why not just talk to the manager anyway and try to figure out some type of partnership, around that? And I decided not to because it would cost too much to the human spirit. I think there's a great degree of food charity. In fact, you throw a rock in Baltimore, before it lands, it's going to hit 10 different food charity programs before it hits the ground. But I am encouraged by the writings and the thoughts of people who really speak to what that does to the human soul over time when you're constantly in a position of subservience and dependency, total dependency on a basic need to be alive. I said, no, we're not going to do that. I stomped out. I walked right across that street. I had a Holy Ghost hissy fit. I walked across the street back toward my office at Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. And as I'm stomping there, I'm having this conversation with God. I know where I am, but I'm saying I'm having a conversation with God. God taps me on the shoulder and say, why are you mad? I said, God, you know why I'm mad. Here it is. We have exactly what we need right at our fingertips, and we can't afford it. It's a different kind of frustration. Communities that are deeply labeled deeply weighted down, burdened by the effects of food apartheid. It's a terrible experience in reality. That's not my neighborhood. I live around the corner from the church. That picture they put up, there's options there. But it's a different kind of frustration when you can see what you need and still can't grab it. That's different frustration. And that was ours. And so I said, God, that's why I'm mad. It's right there at our fingertips and we cannot get it. And I heard God say, look to your right. And the next picture, next slide. And when I looked to the right, this is what I saw. Now, to the left of this picture, the church has owned that little side of the yard for eons, long before I got there. And the other side of the yard at the time of this picture was privately owned by an elderly gentleman who was so tired of cutting the grass, he paid a dump truck to come and dump rocks and stones all over top his grass so he didn't have to cut the grass anymore. I walk past it all the time on the way into the church, every day, Sunday through Saturday. I walk past it all the time. But that day, I had an epiphany. That day, God showed me something. So if you can't afford what they have, then you grow on what you already own. And that's what we started to do. I went inside our church and I started preaching this sermon, this message. Hey, y'all, we own a little bit of land and we can grow something on the land that we have, can't we? And people got excited and said, yes, Pastor, we can do it. And as we shared that message and got excited and organized, we were able to work together. Next slide, to transform this into that. And that is our 1,500 square foot garden. We've been growing since 2010, we've been growing on this 1,500 square feet. We grow about 1,200 pounds of produce each year right here in the front yard, in part of the front yard of the Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. And I was amazed, grateful, and thankful for the partnership with our congregation and literally being the solution, and being a part of the solution of what we needed for our own community. Next slide. And as I think about that garden, I think about this woman right here. Her name is Sister Maxine Nicholas. She just passed last year in November at the age of 83 years old. But when I stood up in the congregation and I said, hey, y'all, we can grow food on the land that we own, she was one of the first ones that stood up. Now, at the time that I said this, I was late 20s, and I'm thinking we're going to start this revolutionary, food thing. And all the young people in the church, they're going to get behind this revolutionary pastor and we're going to make a difference on food. I'm waiting for all the young adults to come get with me, right? And the first day in the garden, when it was time to set up the raised beds, young adults came out. I said, yes, we are ready. We're going to do this. They took out their phones. They took selfies and groupies all on the land. And then after they got their pictures, I ain't see them the next week. But I will tell you who kept on showing up. It was Sister Maxine Nicholas. Her and what I call the AARP Club, all of them got together. The seniors of the congregation got together. And they're the ones who came out to really keep the garden going. And it really taught me a whole lot. I had overlooked them. I had overlooked the seniors in my congregation. I studied the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, but I didn't connect the dots that many of those African Americans ended up in cities like Baltimore, who grew up on farms in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, go down the line. And though they came north and got jobs in the education system and in factories and other places, that knowledge and that familiarity around agrarian living and agriculture was still deep within them. And so when their young pastor who didn't know nothing about farming stood up talking about let's grow food, it spoke to something deep within them. I overlooked them. But I also overlooked the fact that these churches, our historically African-American congregations, own so much in the way of material assets, right? And so there's land. There are parking lots that are used primarily one day out the week, that Monday through Saturday sit there largely underutilized. There are commercial kitchens or close to commercial kitchens inside these churches that are utilized once or twice a week, but just sit there largely underutilized. There are classrooms. There are facilities. There's a whole range of resources that Black people own outright that sit there Monday through Saturday. We utilize it one day out the week, rest of the week, it sits there. I overlooked it, but my brain started doing something. I started playing with this idea of what if? What if you could connect the dots of this vast inventory of assets, resources, people, culture, and history, and create a systemic response to the systemic problem of food inequity and food apartheid? Next slide. So I started studying. Somebody had to do this before. Somebody had to flirt with these ideas before. There's nothing unique about a Heber Brown. Somebody did it. And the pages of the library started pointing me in the direction of people like Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Anybody who knows anything about Marcus Garvey, one of the first things that comes to people's minds is Back to Africa movement, Back to Africa. That's the guy who was organizing Black people in the early 20th century to go back to Africa. It's terrible that his life and his movement is boiled down to that. So much more expansive. One of the things that he and the UNIA was serious about was organizing the assets of Black people to create the solutions that they needed here as well. Food was in that equation too. So they had restaurants, they had grocery stores. In fact, there's an ad in the Negro World Weekly, their publication, and in that it's really fine and hazy, but it talks about their grocery stores. Grocery store number 1 on West 138th Street in New York, grocery store number 2 and 3, and the restaurants that go along with that. And in addition, the immediate successor to Marcus Garvey, President James Stewart, took Marcus Garvey's idea of having this farm and took it and actually established it in Oregonia, Ohio. And so the Universal Negro Improvement Association and Garveyism as ideology understood that food and liberation and freedom go together. Next slide. Another group, Father and Mother Divine and the Peace Mission Movement. Some of you may be familiar with the Peace Mission Movement and Father Divine. Father Divine as well understood that social uplift, as black people were concerned in this country, had to have a relationship with agriculture, food, and farming. As I tend to say, and I wrote a little song about it for our Freedom School back in my church, whoever controls the food controls the people. And in the context of that, even Father Divine, who had a interracial ministry and movement that bought property and land and had wonderful dynamic feasts in the midst of the Great Depression in this country. And as an aside, really quickly, their feast was a way that they were testifying about the power of their God to give abundant food in the midst of economic calamity in the country. But Father and Mother Divine as well had farms, restaurants, grocery stores, and understood it as a part of their faith. Next slide. Reverend Vernon Johns, farmer, pastor, seminary president. Brilliant academic, brilliant preacher, learned preacher and scholar, spoke multiple languages, and he would frustrate his congregation because he would preach in overalls and farm boots. He was a farm boy. All the degrees, he didn't forget that he was a farm boy at the end of the day. And so he would do things like preach in his overalls, and then after church on Sunday, he would sell watermelon and corn and stuff on the front porch of the church. The church he pastored, Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, one of the churches he pastored, was so upset about him doing that they kicked him out of the church and decided to pick a much safer preacher to be their pastor next, one who would keep quiet, and that next pastor was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. You kind of know how that worked out. But Reverend Vernon Johns started the Virginia Farm and City Enterprises. He raised livestock, 100 acres of land in Prince Edward County, Virginia. Next slide. And he also really putting forward this theme of urban and rural African Americans working together to create our own food system and the industries that can surround that as well. It's a very rare book to find, but it's a powerful book, an essay, a Negro agrarian culture. For sake of time, I won't read it, but we can discuss it later. But he was putting forward this idea in the mid-20th century. Next. Fannie Lou Hamer. Isn't it terrible that her life is boiled down to 9 words? I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. But Fannie Lou Hamer did so much more than just say those 9 words. She also furthered food sovereignty efforts in her community. I will read this quote. She said, "Food is used as a political weapon. But if you have a pig in your backyard and if you have some vegetables in your garden, you can feed yourself and your family and nobody can push you around." As you can see, for Fannie Lou Hamer, it wasn't just about food access. It wasn't just about getting nutrient-rich food, but it was a political statement. A socio-political statement is being made by these African Americans who are recognizing that their liberation, their freedom, their dreams and aspirations for self-actualization and communal actualization would come through agriculture and controlling your own food system. Next slide. Fannie Lou Hamer had Freedom Farm Co-op in Ruleville, Mississippi, Sunflower County, 640 acres of land, and they had a pig bank. As you can tell, I'm a little excited about the pig bank. Actual pig bank, not like the thing you put coins in, the actual pig bank. Partnered with Dr. Dorothy Height of the National Council of Negro Women, who purchased the first 54 pigs, donated it to Fannie Lou Hamer, and they trained and taught families how to use that pig to support their families. They had a pig contract to go with it. Families had to sign a contract that once your pig had 2 piglets, you give those 2 piglets back to the bank for the next family to get piglets and pigs to be able to support their family as well. Next slide. So the motto for the National Council of Negro Women at the time of Dr. Dorothy Height's presidency was helping people meet their own needs on their own terms. And I love this photo of her at the March on Washington. Young people think they created the side eye. Dr. Dorothy Height is giving Dr. King the side eye during the March on Washington. Maybe because they took women off the program, but that's another presentation. Next slide. Albert Cleage, Reverend Albert Cleage is another one you have to lift up, who was the founder of the Shrine of the Black Madonna, but he also very quickly put forward this idea of connecting urban and rural African Americans to further food sovereignty in black communities and not be subject to the whims of oftentimes discriminatory and racist policies of the local neighborhoods and communities. Next slide. He put forward this idea of his church buying land, and even after he died, the congregation continued in that dream, and they bought 3,750 acres in western South Carolina. I'm standing there with is the immediate successor of Pastor Klieg. His name is Bishop Kamathi Nelson, and we're going to be getting together later this year because Beulah Land Farms is still in operation, and that church is doing a wonderful job with that acreage. Next. So I wanted to organize the resources of the Black church community for an asset-based approach to food insecurity. Next slide. I'm going to speed up a little bit. Two main objectives of our organization. One, Operation Higher Ground. Two, Soil to Sanctuary Market. Next. Operation Higher Ground. Basically, we work with Black churches to help them grow food on their land. Next slide. I actually go into the congregation. I do what I call congregational organizing. I don't not only shake the hand of the pastor, but I look over the pastor's shoulder for the sister Maxine, because she's going to be the one that actually keeps it going. I've learned that through our experience. And so we organize, we resource, we give seeds, lumber, support. I galvanize people from the community and local colleges and universities to come and support a church in starting their own garden on their own land. I know a lot of municipalities have these efforts where you can get land from the city or the like, but I really focus on church-owned land. In an era of gentrification, dispossession, and displacement, Black people do not have the luxury, this is my very plain talk here now, the luxury to depend on the city's land programs, which can very easily be taken away once value is added to that land by the garden and the group of people working on it. Next slide. Matter of fact, let's roll a little bit. This is just pictures of different churches and the ceremonies and rituals that we do when we break ground on the garden. I take it that serious. When we put shovels in the soil, we sing, we testify, we share our hopes and dreams. We make ceremony around that land and honor the sacredness of it. Next, we'll just keep rolling, and I just want to show you, I'm a little excited. We helped this church in East Baltimore get a high tunnel last summer, and they're going to be doing extended growing now because of that, so I'm really excited about that. First in East Baltimore. Next, and this is just a simple map, grateful for our family and partners at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Every green circle is a circle where we've established a church garden in the city of Baltimore, and every red space is a space that's suffering from food apartheid right now. And so our prayer is that the green circles will eventually overtake the red spaces by utilizing the strength of the anchor institutions of Black churches, which oftentimes are the last institutions standing or the strongest institutions standing in these communities. Next. And this is quickly our Soil to Sanctuary Market. We bring many pop-up farmers markets inside churches on days when they worship. We transform the multi-purpose room. Next slide. You can kind of roll through these too. We transform the multi-purpose room and put a little market inside of them. We bring farmers to the multi-purpose room. You shake the hand of Black farmers. We buy directly from Black farmers to support them in their work. And our attendance and everything, our energy, our strength, it goes up because of these markets on the first Sunday. Our children even who are learning culinary skills and the like are doing workshops and teaching and training and selling their items as well. We work with our Muslim family in West Baltimore as well, and they come over and do workshops. I don't have time, but I'd love, and it may be a different time to talk about the Nation of Islam when it comes to food sovereignty in the Black community. It's hard to have the conversation and not acknowledge that for a very long time, Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam has been furthering food sovereignty as well. Next. I got to speed, y'all. I'm working with young adults in our church to develop the pipeline for people who are thinking in a systems kind of spirituality and food system and an intersection. And so I'll take our young adults around the country to other churches that are growing food or advancing something in the way of agriculture or even climate change and the like, to try to do my part as a pastor and our part as a church to prime the pump and get the pipeline of young adults, especially young African Americans, thinking about how their genius can be put toward these kinds of efforts for our community. Next. And also, just this year, we launched a Young Adult Residential Fellowship Program. Think about it like a Black AmeriCorps program. Our church owns a house behind our worship sanctuary. We bought the house. We're renovating it right now. We're going to start moving young adults into that house for 18 months at a time to study food sovereignty, freedom schools, community service, and to be able to serve that community fresh out of undergrad. Next. And this is just some work that we've been doing this year. These are our first two fellows here, Food Sovereignty Fellow Siobhan Terrell and our Freedom School Fellow Austin Monet McClendon. Next. I think this is my last one. This is the map of the churches, the Black farms, the Black churches, and the seminaries even, that I've been working with for the past 3 years, we are working to create a systemic response, again, to the systemic problem, and networking and linking these spaces and places together. Next. And I don't have time, I'm not going to do it, but we're really what I'm doing is weaving the network. I'm network weaving. I'm going to find who are the local heroes, who are the local organizers, who are the local people in their town, what resources can I put behind them. I'm not flying in to be your Dr. King or your Messiah. I'm giving you resources for your local community. I'm honoring your leadership. And then I'm going to make sure you know this other sister in Detroit and you know this other brother in DC, and working to create this systemic response that way. I think I'll stop there. Thank y'all so much. I appreciate it.